Hey folks, it's me, Dr. Sparkle, back again with episode 51 of Chrontendo. Now, I'll be honest, I've actually had a pretty rough last couple of weeks. Those of you who follow my Twitter account or check the blog will know that our dog Molly passed away recently at the age of 13, and it was all very sudden. She seemed fine, healthy, then one day she acted a little tired. We took her to the vet, and within a week it was all over. And she really was an amazing dog. She discovered breast cancer in two different people, and it's really going to be difficult without her. And then almost immediately afterwards, my wife actually lost her wedding ring. Not lost as in misplaced, but rather gone forever. And even though it's only a ring, she had a great deal of attachment to it. You sort of think of your wedding ring as something you'll carry with you for your entire life, and she was just so broken up over it. But regardless, Chrontendo episode 51 is finally done. And one last thing, I have some changes planned for Chrontendo in the near future. Hopefully changes people will like. More details about this will emerge soon. For today, we have 15 games from late November to early December 1989, including some US-only games. Prepare yourself for another Beam-developed game, and one of the most obscure US games published by Nintendo. Also a couple military strategy games, and two very unusual RPGs, including one from Square. So, let's get started. Yep, the first of two games from November 17th. This one's from Irem, though apparently developed by Tamtex. Gekitotsu Yonku Battle. This is the second mini Yonku game we've seen for the Famicom, and the last, I think. Mini Yonku, as you might recall, were those little highly customizable racing cars that were quite popular among Japanese kids at this time, and maybe still are. We had previously seen a mini Yonku game from Konami a couple months back. That one actually licensed the name of Tamiya, the most popular maker of mini Yonku cars. This one, however, is totally generic. Gekitotsu Yonku Battle is a very minor, slight game. It's a simple top-down arena battle racing deal. Your object here is to collect Teki, which you do by collecting flags, and you get flags by destroying the other cars. Ramming into cars will destroy them. Getting rammed or hitting an obstacle will damage your car. You can see your vehicle's health on the bottom left there. It's the life meter. So the object is to ram enough cars to generate a flag. When this happens, the flag will show up on the mini-map. You then need to rush over to the flag, trying to destroy cars along the way. This will raise the number on the flag. When and if you collect the flag, you will get the number of Teki as were on the flag, up to a maximum of 5. There is always a chance that another car might collect the flag first. And then once you've collected enough Teki, you win the round and move on. And that's actually it. Oh yeah, there are these lame animated scenes between the rounds. I hesitate to call these cutscenes exactly. So a couple points about this game. Each round adds to the selection of cars you can pick, but despite some rad names like Battle, Super Saber, the only difference is the sprites. The cars all function exactly the same as far as I can tell. And there's no sort of customization options or anything like that. It's a very simple game. There are a few special items you can pick up on each level, the turbo thing that makes you go faster, and much more importantly a star that gives you temporary invulnerability. Other than that, there's really not much here other than smashing into cars. There are these bonus stages where you drive around picking up flags for points, which have no in-game purpose other than aiming for a high score. And the weird thing is, there's no two-player mode. That would seem like a good idea for a game like this, though I guess it would require cutting the screen in half. Bottom line, it seems like a well-done game in many ways, but it's just a very, very simple one with not a whole lot to do. It's been a few months since we've seen any Taito games released in Japan, and this episode we have two. First up is Ninja Cop Saizou, though the Japanese version was published by Kyogo Bueki, the same guys who published the Japanese version of Airwolf. Is this about a ninja or about a cop? What if I told you it was about a cop who is also a ninja? The police commissioner has been working on his forearms, as you can see here. Apparently someone is kidnapping some kids, and you need to find out who. Now, if this sounds a little bit like Shinobi, then congratulations on your perceptiveness. I suppose we can safely call Ninja Cop Saizou a Shinobi ripoff. You have a lot of enemies shooting at you from behind crates and things. Really the exact same mechanic as Shinobi is used for attacking. At a distance, you throw a dart of some sort. Up close, you automatically switch to a blade, and you have ninja magic as well. Now, one new feature here is you can walk up to the guys in red and grab them, triggering a little scene where you interrogate them. This doesn't impact the game as far as I can tell, but it does fill in, the details of the story. In April 1990, Taito released this in the US under the name of Wrath of the Black Manta. Manta, by the way, simply means mantle, like a cape or something, in Portuguese. Though I assume the name Black Manta is lifted from the Aquaman character, who you might recall from the Super Friends cartoons and such. The Black Manta here is no longer a cop, he's just a regular New York City civilian ninja. What's interesting is that even while he's hanging out at his home, he's still wearing his ninja outfit. All the cutscenes were changed for the US version. Actually, quite a bit in this game has been altered. For the life of me, I don't understand how the kid left a note at the scene of the kidnapping saying he was being held to the waterfront, since obviously he was taken to the waterfront after he got kidnapped. The game mechanics are pretty much the same as in the Japanese version. Here you see the new art for when you interrogate a thug. It's not known who's responsible for the US version, but they lifted a few drawings from the old How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way, which is a book that Marvel put out in the 70s, I believe. Curiously, a Mindscape game called Infiltrator also stole an image from that very same book. One unique feature in Black Manta is doors. Tons of doors to enter. Each door leads to a small room containing either a note with a hint, or a power-up of some sort, or a few enemies. The rooms do have one helpful function. Killing the enemies inside will restore some of your health. In theory, though, what we want are the rooms with the kidnapped kids. Now, the art here is rather obviously traced from a photo or someone else's drawing. I don't know where they stole this image from. The bad guys' organization is called DRAT, Drug Runners and Terrorists, and there is sort of an anti-drug, clean up the streets theme going on here. By comparison, here's the much more cutesy, kawaii version of the kid in Ninja Cop Saizou. Here's the first boss. His name is Tiny. Using the shadow magic against him, which creates like a duplicate ninja on top of you, you can easily shoot his head, so that magic is quite helpful. By contrast, here's the Japanese version. He's shorter for one. And this is the Japanese in-level cutscene, whereas the US version has a sort of slightly more cinematic cutscene. Black Manta and Ninja Cop Saizou diverge in the second level. Manta has an air level where you fly a ninja kite, believe it or not. Then a jungle scene, and then some more subterranean tunnels. Whereas in Ninja Cop Saizou, you have these scenes where you sort of jump around in a city landscape and then find like a giant warehouse or something. I can't really call Wrath of Black Manta a very good game. The levels are pretty repetitive with a few exceptions. A lot of time is spent opening doors and looking in rooms. Your character moves slowly. Just like Shinobi, you have to do a whole lot of ducking in order to avoid enemy fire, which gets irritating after a while. So it's not a terrible game, but I would hesitate to call it good. Ah yes, another entry in the Who Gives a Shit file, Cosmic Epsilon. This was the first of 2 games we have today, published by Asmic Ace, whose logo was a cute little dragon, and this was developed by Home Data, a rather undistinguished company whose credit to this point included Squoon, that was that submarine shoot-'em-up game, and Konami's Astro Boy game, as well as a few other things which you probably do not remember.
Good luck.
This is a cool intro, and if I'm not mistaken, the whole mech suit launching itself using rails was sort of a cliche that originated in one of those damn Japanese space cartoons. Well, this is obviously a Space Harrier clone. You know, I like the look of this. I mean, rather than going with the checkerboard pattern on the ground, they used airport runways? I'm really not sure. And the destroyed city in the background looks cool. You have 2 weapons, dual laser beam things, which you can power up if you hold down the fire button, and a ball of energy thing that is supposedly a homing missile, but which really didn't seem to home in on any enemies whenever I fired it. This is also a 3D game. Pressing select activates the 3D mode. You might recall Nintendo sold something called the Famicom 3D system, which were these electric shutter-based 3D goggles. Hardly any games were released for this thing, but Square put out a few, Rad Racer and the second 3D World Runner game. I believe Cosmic Epsilon is the last game that used the 3D system. Nintendo would obviously return to the 3D concept a couple times in the future. Other than that, there's really not much interesting about this game. Here's the first boss, which looks like the thing that dropped the bomb in the opening cutscene. Cosmic Epsilon alternates between levels that take place in outer space and those that take place on a planet surface. 8 levels altogether. The enemy designs are kinda cool, I guess, but unless you really can't get enough of Space Harrier clones, there is not much reason to play this. Next up is Terao no Dosukoi Oozumou from Golf-kko. Boy, that guy looks really excited to be in this game. You know, Golf-kko has been really heavily leaning on sports-type games for quite a while now. They didn't really start out that way, but it seems like they've been almost becoming like a sports game specialist, with tons of baseball games, bowling, basketball. They did a judo game, and now a sumo wrestling game. And this one was, of course, developed by Tosa. And I'm not going to go as far as to call this a sumo RPG, but just check this out. Yeah, so you move around on an overworld and have random encounters. This will trigger a wrestling match. Now, the wrestling is pretty simple. You can smack your opponent with your hand, or try to grab him by his jockstrap, and move him backwards. Honestly, just smacking the guy works out pretty well. This drains his energy to the point where you can knock him out of the ring. Another pretty simple method is when you get too close to the edge of the ring, you can often spin him around so that he's on the edge, and then you can hopefully try to knock him out. Defeating an opponent will cause an item to drop, such as this coin, which increases your experience. Maybe this really is an RPG. Those things that look like tree stumps are actually sumo wrestling gems, which are required to make progress throughout the story. Here I tried a throw move, which didn't quite push him out, but was close enough that I was able to win the match. Defeating the guy in the sumo gym gives you a pass of some sort to board the nearby ship, which then allows you to travel to the next island. So it is sort of very Dragon Quest-y, at least in the way that it lays out the game world. There are also shops that allow you to buy new special moves, and a few items that have uses in the game. The objective is to travel around the world and defeat all the other sumo champs. Don't expect anything too complex. The matches are all pretty simple, with very little strategy required. But this game is really not that bad, and the whole sumo quest angle kind of puts a bit of life into what would have been a very routine game. So I'm certainly not going to consider this be some kind of unknown masterpiece on the Famicom, but it's better, I suppose, than I thought it was going to be. Our third game from November 24th is Vegas Connection from Sigma Enterprise and developed by Graphic Research. Now there's a story mode and a casino mode listed here, and I'll get this straight away off my chest. I could not get the story mode to work. It looks like you just are supposed to select a save spot and enter your name just like you would do in every other game with a battery save, but I could not select any of the 3 spaces. The story mode definitely exists. I found evidence of that on the internet, and maybe you have to unlock it somehow by winning some money on the casino mode. I'm really not sure. Maybe the ROM is defective? I don't know. So much for the story mode, but the actual gambling portions of the game are pretty damn basic. Look how they animated the falling coins. That's a nice touch. So 3 games, that's all you get. Slots, roulette, and blackjack. Now I really don't understand the point of these games. First of all, slots and roulette are purely luck games, and seem pretty much pointless to me. For the slot machines game, you get to choose the number of lines you want, meaning you can get jackpots on horizontal, vertical, and diagonal matches if you like, and this costs more coins to play naturally. Alright, so basically you just pull the lever. Pretty exciting. Maybe you'll win some imaginary money. Roulette is just plain old roulette. Put some chips down, the wheel spins. I guess I can't really criticize Sigma that much for putting out a generic casino game, but this is really very, very no frills. I'm guessing the story mode version is a bit more interesting. And finally, Blackjack, a game which requires at least some basic decision-making skills, and luck. They threw in a cute lady dealer for this one, so I guess this is probably the best game of the 3. Bottom line, this is a completely unnecessary addition to the Famicom gambling game library, unless the story mode is somehow actually good. Oh boy, the last Famicom Disk System game of 1989. Lutter, published by Athena, which is a pretty small company, and from which I believe we've only seen 1 game so far. I have no idea what the name Lutter is supposed to mean. It's not any obvious mistransliteration of an English word as far as I can tell. So, Lutter is not the most beautiful game ever on the Famicom. In fact, it looks downright archaic by 1989 standards. This sure feels like a Japanese computer game, maybe like something ported from the MSX, but I actually couldn't find any evidence online of this being a port. Lutter is also a game that seems kind of baffling the first time you load it up without any sort of knowledge about how it's played. It looks like Lode Runner, but without the ability to dig holes, and pressing the buttons just brings up windows, including a whole bunch of RPG-style stats. Yeah, so sure, this looks like utter bullshit, but once you figure it out, it's really not that bad. Lutter is divided up into several castles, each with multiple rooms, and a boss you must fight at the end. The objective is simply to make your way through the castle to the boss room, which will require you finding keys, opening up new areas, getting items that will allow you to access new parts of the castle, When you put it that way, Lutter sounds almost kind of like a primitive Metroidvania game. There are also RPG elements. You have levels, stats, and equipable items. Now you actually fight enemies directly simply by running right into them. There's no button pressing required. The enemies seem to do considerably more damage to you if you let them walk into you, or if they land on your head. For the most part though, if you don't screw up, you'll easily kill enemies and eventually level up, raising your stats. In the early levels, the castle layout is quite simple. You can sometimes move freely from room to room, and in other cases you'll need to find a key that will remove an obstruction, or use an item that fills in a gap in the floor allowing you to cross over it. There isn't any sort of jumping in Lutter, though you can fall off platforms to land on the platform below unharmed. You can also find armor and weapons in these rather ugly looking chest things. Any equipment is actually equipped as soon as you open the chest, so while Lutter has RPG elements in it, it doesn't really feel like an RPG since battles, leveling up, equipment management, all that stuff is pretty much done automatically, and you can really sort of ignore the RPG stuff completely. Likewise, the fact that there's no attack button or jump button makes this feel very out of place on the Famicom. Aside from the sort of similarities to Lode Runner, the game will remind you a lot of ASCII's Castle Quest, known as Castle Excellent in Japan. Another really ancient game from 1986. We covered that, I believe, in Chrontendo episode 12. It also lacks the satisfaction of a good Metroidvania game. From what I played, there really isn't that much sense of surprise or exploration. It feels almost more like a puzzle game. Now, the first boss is way easier than you might think it would be. Overall, this is a pretty fascinating game, way more interesting than I would assume that a late period FDS game from a very minor publisher would actually be, so it's definitely worth a look. Hey, you know what I could really use right about now? A totally unnecessary golf game developed by Tosa. Here we have Golf-kko Open, published by Taito. This rather cute and charming intro ends with you straight up killing this dude with a golf ball, and then teeing off while standing on his body. Look this guy, he ain't getting up again. So the game itself begins with you choosing your golf clubs and then getting assigned a caddy. This is your caddy here. You can ask your caddy for advice, and from what I understand, this caddy's advice is not particularly helpful. Reading up on this game online, that seemed to be a common criticism among Japanese folks who have played it. So this is your standard 18 holes of golf, pretty much a bare-bones golf video game. If anything, the control scheme is simpler than most such games. There don't really appear to be any gimmicks here, or really anything to distinguish this from the several other dozen Famicom golf games, other than the relatively clean, simple, yet pleasant graphics. We've sort of reached a point in the Famicom's library where we've just seen so much of this kind of thing already, and at this point, I mean, what more can we really expect from a golf game? There have been a tiny handful of titles that have done something interesting with the concept, but most are just like this. I mean, just pay Tosa to make the game, put a cute cartoon on the box art, and some people will buy it. So that pretty much wraps up Golf-kko Open. Let's move on to the next game. The last Japanese game of November 1989, and it's the one you've been waiting for. Or not. It's a weird one though. Square's Tom Sawyer. The title screen reads Square No Tom Sawyer, though the box art actually has the English text Square's Tom Sawyer across the top. So this is an RPG based on Tom Sawyer, and is incredibly the second Tom Sawyer Famicom game of 1989. The first, which is called The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, was published by Seta and came out in February. It was a more typical action game. We covered it in Chrontendo episode 42. This game was, of course, released in Japan only, though there was an old translation started some years ago, and we now have a new partial translation from some guys going under the name D Manufacturer. Only the first part of the game is translated so far, but it will give us a good feel for the game. So, Square's Tom Sawyer is an RPG, albeit a rather unusual one. First of all, rather than your typical top-down viewpoint, we have this 3/4 side view, and there's no overworld at all. You move around entirely on paths that mostly run left to right, with occasional intersections that let you move up or down one screen. The way this world is laid out kind of reminds me a lot of Capcom's Willow game. The world is divided into two types of areas: towns, where you can talk to people, enter some buildings, and where there are no enemies. Outside of towns, you'll find areas where there are few or no NPCs, and you are randomly attacked by enemies. These areas are usually woods, swamps, and at least in one case, a city. These outside of town areas sort of act like the overworld in, most Famicom RPGs. You need to travel through them to reach a new town or find some item that moves the plot forward. In the first town, you talk to a few NPCs, you get a couple items, can collect 2 other party members, Jim and Amy. Jim, of course, had a much bigger role in the Tom Sawyer sequel, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and Amy is one of Tom's girlfriends. The main female character from Tom Sawyer, Becky, also makes appearances in the game but cannot be a party member. Tom Sawyer is sort of an odd game. Just like DAO, it doesn't really adhere to RPG conventions of the time. There are a number of items in the game, but these are either one-use items used to refill your health or something, or are simply used to advance the storyline. There are no weapons or armor, neither is there money or experience points. You do have some basic stats such as attack, defense, and quickness. You also have hit points, and you can level up, sort of, when you rest. For example, you can rest at Tom's home in the first village. This increases your hit points, attack, and so on. But for the most part, traditional RPG mechanics are really not used in Tom Sawyer. Battles also play out very strangely. The Final Fantasy side-by-side view is dropped here, and instead you sort of have this over-the-shoulder Phantasy Star 2 perspective. But the enemies are way off in the distance, and you run towards the horizon in order to attack them. Likewise, they jump and land right in front of your party to attack you. There's no magic in this game, but you do have what this particular translation calls tech, which is a special attack that does more damage but doesn't always work. You can also use items in battle, but for the most part combat is much simpler in Tom Sawyer than it is in, for example, Final Fantasy. It mostly consists of hitting the attack button over and over again. Your initial objective is to make your way through the swamps north of Tom's hometown in order to find Huck. You'll need to give him a piece of bread in order to recruit him. He'll fill out the 4th slot in your party, and at this point you can go forward with a full party pretty much at all times, and you can also find new party members and replace existing ones if you choose. So Tom Sawyer feels very different than Square's previous RPGs, like Final Fantasy 1 and 2. It was produced by Hiromichi Tanaka, a longtime Square employee who later produced the Secret of Mana, Xenogears, and Chrono Cross. He was also the main designer of Final Fantasy XI and 14, after which he retired. The music is by Uematsu and is quite excellent. Square's Tom Sawyer marks the end of the era of old Square, in that it was the last Japanese game published by Square before switching completely to fantasy-themed RPGs. Square made games in various genres up until this, after which they focused exclusively on Final Fantasy and similar RPGs for the next half-decade, up until, I believe, Front Mission in 1995, and that wasn't even actually developed by Square themselves. Square did release Rad Racer 2, of course, but that was created specifically for the US market due to the popularity of Rad Racer over here, and it was never released in Japan. Due to its lack of a full English translation, Tom Sawyer is one of Square's most little-known RPGs in the West. If anything, it's known here almost exclusively for the shockingly offensive portrayal of Jim. This was pretty typical of Japan back in the 1980s. They had a fascination with crude racial stereotypes of black people at this time, You'll recall last episode we mentioned the band Rats and Star, who literally performed in blackface. Things have changed quite a bit since 1989 in Japan, but at the time this was the sort of thing that was pretty much accepted over there. Here we have your first boss battle. Beating these guys gives you the pendant, which is used to obtain the license from Becky, which allows you to get some guy blocking your way later in the game to move. Eventually you'll make your way to the final area, which is a cave, and fight the final boss, who is Injun Joe. While this is certainly not Square's best Famicom game, it is an intriguing look at Square exploring a very different direction than they took in the 90s. Once the new translation is complete, this would probably be worth your time to check out. Before we move on to December 1989, we need to finish up a few US and Europe-only releases, starting with one of the most obscure NES titles published by Nintendo themselves. This is To the Earth. The intro is pretty good. The story here is that an alien invasion force is unleashing biological weapons on Earth, and for some reason there is an antidote, but it's on Neptune. So you have to fly the antidote all the way to the Earth, which explains the title of the game. You are literally going to the Earth. First, however, you must go to Uranus. A couple things about this game. First of all, it's clearly a Zapper game, one of the last Zapper-based games, the very last being another forgotten Nintendo-published game in 1990. There were a few later games where using the Zapper was optional in some spots, however. Second, it has a reputation for being very fast-paced and reasonably difficult. All the ships move very, very quickly and are hard to hit. However, on an emulator it is virtually impossible. It's hard as hell to hit anything when using an emulator, so I could not get anywhere. You lose energy when you fire and miss an enemy, which makes it really tough since it's so easy to miss when playing via emulation. The third thing about the game is we don't know who made it. Nintendo had released a few games specifically for the US market that were not localizations of Japanese games, but these were all developed by Rare. To the Earth clearly isn't a Rare game, and the name Cirque Verte was found in the copyright records, though we have no idea who Cirque Verte is. GDRI speculates there might be some connection with Locomotive, the company that helped develop Star Tropics, but there's really no concrete evidence for this. To the Earth appears to be basically disowned by Nintendo. It's never been re-released in any form, as far as I know. Even Donkey Kong Jr. Math got a Virtual Console release. So definitely among the very most forgotten Nintendo-published NES games. The last thing anyone wants to see this episode is a Mindscape game, especially one developed by Beam. Unfortunately, we are forced to deal with 720 degrees. Prepare to be amazed by Beam's programming skills in about 1 second. Yeah, that music. But you know, these things were made as quickly and cheaply as possible, so we really can't exactly expect Castlevania here. Now, this is the third Mindscape game we've seen, the first two also being ports of Atari arcade games, namely Paperboy and Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. Those were done by Tengen, I believe, whereas Beam is the Australian company responsible for Back to the Future and Three Stooges for the NES. 720 Degrees is pretty similar to Skate or Die. You compete in a series of skating events, with some being pretty much the same in both games, such as doing tricks on the halfpipe. There is one big difference though. In 720 Degrees you can roam around freely in what's either a skate park or just a large public square that just happens to have lots of ramps and things. If If you explore the edges and corners, you'll find there's entrances to competitions as well as shops to buy better equipment. Now, this particular game design element seemed pretty fresh when 720 first hit arcades in 1986. While the NES port isn't fondly remembered, the arcade game was pretty popular at the time. Unlike earlier games like Track and Field, which just dropped you right into each event, you could sort of start the game by goofing off and just kind of cruising around the game world before entering the actual skating events. You could practice tricks, search for money, and just goof off. It has an appeal similar to today's open-world sandbox games like Grand Theft Auto. Of course, this was designed to eat quarters, so an angry swarm of killer bees would come after you if you spent too much time dicking around. Killer bees being something that was much talked about back in the 80s, though they never did really arrive in great numbers in California and kill everyone like we thought they were going to back then. Now, playing on an emulator is tricky since it had this circular rotating joystick, which you used to control the direction your skateboard pointed in. Also, the soundtrack, art design, and even the cabinet design made it really stand out at the arcades. Unfortunately, approximately 0% of the appeal was transferred over to the NES port. I mean, visually it completely lacks the style of the original. Your radical skater dude is replaced with some dumbass kid. The music is lame, and it lacks the sort of wild 80s street culture feel of the original. For example, let's compare the music for this event in both versions. So 720 has a grand total of 4 thrilling events to compete in: the downhill skating event, which we just saw, the slalom event, which is uncannily easy. I somehow got the goal the first time I tried it without even knowing exactly what I was doing. The half pipe, which 720 calls the ramp. This is pretty much impossible compared to the slalom. I tried multiple times to get any medal and failed. You need to pull off certain D-pad and button press combinations to do tricks while up in the air. I could occasionally do a trick, but could never really come close to anything consistent. This is like landing the plane in Top Gun. It requires precise timing, which can only be discovered accidentally. And lastly, we have the jump, which is actually just a single jump after a downhill ramp. You are supposed to do tricks while in the air. Not too tough to get some kind of medal. So as far as arcade ports go, 720 is pretty terrible. It doesn't really add anything to the arcade game, which was only designed to be played for like around 10 minutes at a time. 2 events can be mastered almost immediately, and 1 event requires quite a bit of work to get any good at all. So it's certainly not very well balanced. The arcade game's main gimmick, that is the circular joystick movement, can't be replicated here, and it doesn't really feel anything like the original. Overall, it's not very fun. One final US-only title for November, it's Tetris. This is the 4th version of Tetris for a Nintendo console that we've seen so far. Back in December 1988, the Japanese version of Tetris was released from Bulletproof Software. Then, in May 1989, there was the ill-fated US version from Tengen. We covered the whole debacle over Tetris rights in Tengen's Tetris back in Chrontendo episode 45. We also briefly looked at the extremely successful Game Boy Tetris, once again developed by Bulletproof Software, and today we check out the final version of the original Tetris game for the NES. This is the Nintendo-published port that the Tengen version would have been in competition with had Nintendo not quashed its release. This was developed internally by Nintendo, it seems, and it's okay. There's 2 modes, the regular mode and also the second mode, which probably no one ever plays. There's 3 music tracks, and there's really nothing wrong with Nintendo's Tetris. However, pretty much everyone agrees that Tengen's Tetris is better. It has 2 player modes, both co-op and versus, more music tracks. It's simply a nicer game. Nintendo's Tetris is just plain old Tetris. I guess nothing wrong with that, but it is presented in pretty much a bare-bones release. It plays very well, and if the Tengen Tetris never existed, then I guess this would be considered to be like an NES classic. But unfortunately it ended up being both a really great game and something of a disappointment at the same time. Yes, December 1989, here at last. Let's kick this off with a little game called Conflict. It's a nice flicker effect here. So, tanks, helicopters, and jets. What kind of game is this? A commando clone? A vertical shoot-'em-up? Well, no, it's actually a military strategy game, more or less in the style of Military Madness. There are options for 1 or 2 players, and you can choose if you want to be limited to moving 3 units per turn, as opposed to being able to move all your units. There's a stage select screen, difficulty settings, and then of course the actual game itself. Not exactly super pretty looking. Now Conflict was released in the US as well in mid-1990, so let's take a closer look. There are 2 sides, rather creatively called Blue and Red, and you have your typical hex-based maps. There's forests, mountains, and so on, each of which will affect or hamper movement or increase your defense. There's also cities and airports which heal, or technically resupply, your units. Those ugly-looking blue boxes are factories, which construct new units. This uses something the game calls fame points. It shows your fame points when you open up the command menu. So here, for example, I have 5,000. Fame points are earned by doing good stuff, like winning battles, and are lost by losing battles, or even worse, fleeing from battles. Everything in this game sort of revolves around fame points. As with all these type games, there's a rock, paper, scissors element here, with certain units being strong against some types and weak against others. Anti-aircraft guns are good against planes, for example, while planes tend to be strong against ground forces. Now, I don't know if I'd call Conflict deep, but it does require a certain amount of investment to play. There's quite a few units which have mostly been given numbers for names, like F-15s, A-27s, F-23s. There's a lot of aircraft, 9 types altogether, compared to 3 tanks and 2 infantry type forces. Units also have more than one way to attack. There's a primary and secondary type weapon on these things. There's a number of defensive options, none of which are intuitively named. This jet, for example, has turn, swing, accelerate, descend, and look. You definitely need to get a copy of the manual or a FAQ in order to figure out how to play this thing. Here I swung when I think I should have accelerated or descended. Conflict was published by Gekitotsu, and I'm not sure who developed it. As I mentioned, it's kind of an ugly looking game, and I hate those little rectangular boxes that your units appear in. It's sort of hard to distinguish one unit from the other just by the graphics, so they've added text to the boxes, which unfortunately is often kind of laid right on top of the graphics, making it somewhat hard to read. In other ways, however, Conflict is pretty slick. The animations are actually kind of cool in spots. Conflict seems overall okay. I'd probably pick Famicom Wars over this if you were looking for a fun military strategy game, however. Hey folks, how would you feel if I told you that today we have a game from the publishers of Super Monkey Daiboken, but what if this game was developed by a company that was one of the developers who worked on Mother and Earthbound? Would you feel confused, conflicted? Well, good, so now you know how I feel. This is Dao, published by VAP and developed by Pax Softnica, who worked on several games for Nintendo such as Volleyball, Ice Hockey, Mother, and a few of the Nintendo FDS adventure games. They also did some boring stuff from VAP, namely a baseball game and a badminton game. I'd tell you the names of those games, but I can guarantee that you would not remember them, and neither can I. Dao was never released outside of Japan, but we have a translation which makes it playable, but perhaps not completely understandable. This is some deep stuff, man. Okay, so you are the red guy. Dao is very much in the mode of the traditional Dragon Quest style RPG, at least visually at first glance. We've seen this so many times, we know what to do. You go around town, talk to people, check out the shops, talk to the main dude who explains your quest. Except, Dao doesn't really have you do any of that stuff. In fact, the concept behind Dao appears to be, what if we had an RPG that was nothing but fetch quests? Or at least that's what the game felt like for the time that I played it. As we'll see, it's a very odd game. As you walk around town, you'll find the typical collection of NPCs who say stupid stuff to you. There's a meteor crash site where some researchers have dug up a mysterious artifact. There's a train station and a helicopter pad, neither of which can be used at this point. There's a temple, which again, mostly has a lot of monks inside who gab about nothing particularly useful, but instead discuss various religious matters. Dao has a religious theme, as the name might suggest, and we get a lot of talk about Buddhist themes in the first village. Later towns have different religious beliefs. The first incident of sort that actually occurs is when you exit the village and find this old lady who demands you carry her back to the temple. Upon entering the temple, she turns into a demon and steals some sacred items. Now at this point, you can move on to the second village. The method of transport is a giant dinosaur that you ride, which seems completely out of place with the rest of the game. And again, everyone here is obsessed with religion, and there's a giant wrecked cathedral, and folks talking about lost pigs and stuff. One thing you won't find in either village is any typical RPG stuff. There's no shops, inns, equipment, guys who teach you magic, none of that stuff. There's also no overworld per se, just these little paths outside the villages, which have a couple buildings you can visit. You fight your first enemy battle here, and again, it doesn't really follow typical RPG protocol at all. Rather than selecting from a menu, you simply hit the A button over and over again, slowly draining the enemy's health bar. In a way, this game sort of takes the Dragon Quest VII approach to RPGs. It takes quite a while before you actually get your first battle. I didn't really encounter many random enemies until I reached the 4th town, and there's only 6 towns. So 6 towns, no overworld. What is there to do in this game, you might wonder? Mostly travel back and forth between the same 6 towns over and over again, talking to people, which will occasionally unlock new events, and occasionally fighting a boss of sorts. What's irritating about all the travel is it's always done by trains, which is linear. So to get from Town 4 back to Town 1, you take a trip from Town 4 to Town 3, then a second train ride from Town 3 to Town 2, and then from Town 2 back to Town 1. I assume the helicopter eventually unlocks and lets you travel directly to any town using a helipad. And you know, even though this is called an RPG, it feels more like an adventure game that has sort of been awkwardly forced into behaving like an RPG. You mostly progress by wandering around talking to people attempting to move the plot forward, though calling it a plot is perhaps a bit generous. There isn't even any experience points or stats. You do get money from winning battles, but money is mostly used to pay for the non-stop train trips that the game requires. There are a few things you can spend it on, however, later in the game. In conclusion, Dao is a pretty strange game. It looks like an RPG, but playing it feels sort of like wandering around talking to NPCs. Its subject matter and strangeness might appeal to you, but actually playing it feels like a pretty empty experience. This is a reasonably decent intro here. From Pack and Video, we have Mirai Senshi Lios, also transliterated as Mirai Senshi Lios. It was released on December 1st, the same day as Conflict, which is significant because both games are military strategy type games. Though while Conflict is sort of based on real-world combat, it features tanks and jet planes, Mirai Senshi Lios is pure fantasy and exists in a world of RPG castles and anime-style giant robots, sometimes called mechs by the Geekarati. The good news is that we have an English translation, by Aeon Genesis no less. I guess your character Lios is a prince or some such nonsense. Now I mentioned that this is a military strategy game, but it's really more like a tactical RPG in some ways. The tactical RPG as we know it didn't really quite exist yet, but it's definitely a very different style of game than something like Conflict. There's a certain amount of RPG-style customization here, something not found in the many, if any, of the traditional military games we've encountered. You have multiple types of leg and arms that you can equip. These impact your stats, the speed over which you can traverse different types of terrain, your weight point, meaning how much weight you can hold. It's all pretty complicated. You move around on an overworld and encounter enemies on each square. Some squares will contain a special weapon or piece of equipment, and others contain nothing of interest. Battles are turn-based. By default, you control the commander directly. The commander is the most powerful unit and is the one that we were choosing the equipment for earlier. The other units move automatically but are controlled using a few different options. For example, there's attack, assault, all-out assault, cover, and so on. Just like with Conflict, you need to sort of study up on what these commands actually do. For example, attack has the unit head towards the enemy commander, but will attack any other enemy units it comes in contact with along the way, while all-out assault will head towards the enemy commander and or the enemy shuttle, but not attack any of the regular units. There's a total of 8 different automated commands, or you can simply choose manual, which lets you directly control your unit instead. And another little twist. You have a shuttle, which resupplies your units. It's a thing that looks kind of like a mini space shuttle. You don't have to move it around manually. You select which unit you want to resupply, then it flies off and returns automatically. You can supply 1 unit per turn. The object here is to destroy the other team's commander as well as their shuttle. Once you win the battle, you return to the overworld and proceed. It's a creative and pleasant-looking little game, and one that definitely takes a very different road than the other military games we've seen so far. It did feel a little slow-moving and tedious to me, possibly because when the units attack each other, they seem to miss a lot, but it definitely might interest some of you. Okay, the last game this episode, and we are still stuck on December 1st. From Chrontendo, it's Hostages, the Embassy Mission, a rather strange game. Note the credit to Infogrames, we'll come back to that later. Pretty sick soundtrack here as well. However, most folks watching this will know it by its American title, Rescue, the Embassy Mission. Not sure why the name was changed. Maybe Hostages sounded a little too violent for a game bearing the Nintendo seal of quality? Now I mentioned this was a strange game, and here's the thing, it's incredibly short for this sort of game. While you can't really assign a length, something like 720 degrees, Hostages is an action game with 3 different levels, and it only takes around 7-8 minutes or so to play through the entire thing. I just released a so-called long play video for this thing, and the entire video, including like opening, cutscenes, credits, everything was like 7 minutes. That was done on regular difficulty, and I was playing through it as fast as I can, but still, that's really not much of a game. And keep in mind, I've never even heard of this game until now, and when I finished it for the first time, my clear time, the actual time playing like the action portions, not including the menus and those kinds of things, was less than like 5.5 minutes. So this is like a freaking $40 game that you could easily beat in less than 15 minutes. Now there's harder difficulty levels, and the message that you get at the end is different if, for example, none of your team members gets killed, but there's really not a whole lot of replay value to this, at least as an adult there's not much. So as I mentioned, there's just 3 sections. The first is where you run along a little stretch of embassy wall and avoid the searchlights by lying prone on the ground or hiding in a doorway or doing this rolling jump thing. Really not that much to it. If you die, the next guy of your 3-member team gets to go. And if you wanted to reduce your time on this, you could get one guy all the way through safely, and then get the other 2 quickly killed. The second section is a brief sniping sequence. So for each of the team members that made it through the first section, you can use them to shoot guys in the windows with a sniper rifle. There are 9 windows in all. There are terrorists that sort of move around on each floor, and when you see them, you can shoot them. If all 3 team members are alive, you can do this 3 times, with each one on a different side of the embassy building. Or you can skip the whole damn thing. The game doesn't require you to shoot anyone, and doing so doesn't really seem to have that much impact on the next section at all. At least, once again, not on regular difficulty. On higher difficulty, there's a lot more terrorists in the building, so I guess it might be somewhat convenient to take out a few of them before going in. It's hilarious, but far and away the hardest part in this game is right here, rappelling down the walls. This is done by alternating between pressing up and down on the D-pad, slowly lowering yourself to a window, and then you can sort of break through the window and enter the embassy building. Once inside, you simply need to kill all the terrorists. Now, it might come as no surprise based on the modular game design and the robotic gameplay, but Hostages, the embassy mission, was originally a European computer game called simply Hostages, published by Infogrames and developed by a Spanish company called New Frontier. It was released on everything from the Commodore 64 to the ZX Spectrum to the MSX, but I believe that the Atari ST and Amiga versions were the first versions of this game, being released in 1988. Aside from the somewhat better graphics and sound, the ST and Amiga versions are almost exactly the same as the NES version. If anything, the computer versions seem slightly shorter, as they appear to have fewer terrorists to hunt down in the last stage. So as I mentioned, the last section simply involves going through each of the embassy's 3 floors and shooting the terrorists. I suppose they hypothetically shoot back at you, but they don't really seem to pose any danger, at least in the easy or regular difficulty level settings. They are a bit quicker on their toes on the hard difficulty setting. So really what we're doing here is just looking at the map on the left, making sure we enter every room with a dot in it, and then shooting any bad guys. As crazy as it seems, the computer versions got pretty good reviews from some game magazines. A lot of people really seem to like the game when they were kids, which makes sense because kids, often like really repetitive games. So while this has its defenders, it's sort of shocking how little content Hostages has, especially for an NES game that cost like $40 or so back in 1990. Alright, that wraps up another episode. What a horrible selection of games. Best game this episode? I don't know. They're all really not that great. Maybe Tetris? There's a lot of okay games that I can't really get excited about. Lutter was kind of cool. I think I'll take a pass on this one. Worst game? Maybe 720 Degrees. It was pretty terrible. Though there ought to be some kind of mention of Hostages, the embassy mission, just for being so damn short. Well, I'm now pleased to inform you that we have actual great games coming up. Yes, I can assure you that in the next 3 episodes, each episode will have one of those classic games, the ones that you guys have been waiting for. And there's even more great stuff coming up after that as well. So the good game drought is pretty much over, temporarily. Episode 52 will have a influential Japan-only title from Capcom, which just got a new improved translation. So keep your eyes peeled for episode 52 soon, and thanks for watching.